After 8 months of near starvation, death in the Crusader camp from disease and desertion, and as it seemed all hope was lost, events occurred along the way to bolster the Christians. The most important city in Syria, Antioch, was now back in Christian hands. Yet there was little time for celebration. Kurbaga was still coming. Now the besiegers would become the besieged. As he arrived, Kurbaga was able to bolster the force still holding out in the Antioch citadel by sneaking men in under cover of night. The Muslims, with their sizable force, aimed to surround the city. Meanwhile, the Greek force under Tychios was in fact heading back toward Antioch, despite skepticism that he would return. Further, he was not alone. The Emperor Alexios I Comnenus himself led the contingent from Constantinople. On the way back to what they could not yet have known was now a city in Christian hands, the Greeks encountered Stephen II, Count of Blois, who in his eagerness to clarify his own premature departure from the siege of Antioch, informed Comnenus that the Crusader army had been destroyed. After deliberation, both forces together picked up and headed back to the relative safety of Constantinople. Even as they rode, the Crusaders under Bohemond faced Kurbaga. Antioch was totally surrounded to the extent that its topography would allow. The Council of War, weary and more scared than they had been taking the city, looked to Bohemond for a solution. Meanwhile, a soldier and spiritual mystic named Peter Bartholomew approached Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, and shared a vision he was convinced he had seen. Peter told of the presence of St. Andrew himself, that after much prayer and contemplation, he came with a message of hope and possible victory. St. Andrew had assured Peter that buried somewhere under the Cathedral of St. Peter in the center of town was the spear of Longinus, the lance that had pierced the side of Christ on Calvary. According to St. Andrew, as Bartholomew conveyed, if they found the relic, God would grant them victory. Many of the lords were skeptical. Yet, time and again, these events had occurred with seemingly perfect timing and sustained the Crusaders. It appears as if again God was shining on his preferred army. They undertook an excavation even as the enemy was tightening its grip on the city. Peter Bartholomew himself, dirty and with shovel in hand, shot out of the hole under the altar, called for the lights to be brought closer, and with a rusted iron shard in his hand, exclaimed the long-lost spear of Longinus had in fact been found. By some miracle of divine intervention, allegedly, they had found it. News of the discovery spread like wildfire through the city. Whether or not the event or relic was authentic mattered little in the effect it had. For the average crusader, it was a sign from God himself. It proved to boost morale, and the Crusaders found their reserve strengthened. They were absolutely convinced now that they could defeat Kurbaga. His force size, strength, or abilities on the field mattered little, because the Crusaders had the assurance of God himself for the victory. The Crusade leaders put forth a daring plan and prepared to attack Kurbaga head-on. Meanwhile, Count Raymond, the moral leader of the lords and soldiers, fell ill. Bohemond would have to execute the battle himself. Under what he believed to be divine will, Bohemond first sent archers and rows out of the city, exiting by the front gate in full view of Kurbaga's Turks. They actually were able to push back the Muslim advance lines far enough to gain parade space for the soldiers to come out and deploy. Bohemond had created 5 divisions of Crusaders and brought them out in rank as the archers continued to divert and provide cover fire. The ordered deployment aided them in confusing Kurbaga. Bohemond was forcing him to make a quick decision requiring different frames of thought than siege. Kurbaga chose to allow them to gather and bring their whole army out of Antioch, where he thought he could avoid a long siege by just crushing them outside the city all at once, instead of getting trapped up in an urban fighting scenario. One wonders if Bohemond realized the precarious test in which Kurbaga had been placed. Either way, the divine aspect of the battle in the minds of the Crusaders continued to mesmerize. In addition to allowing the Crusaders to stage outside the city walls with relatively little resistance, they were under constant fire from archers that had little impact. Kurbaga sorely underestimated the nature of the Crusader force in front of him, who trusted in their divine assurance most of all. They were in a near impossible situation and as surrounded as one could be around Antioch. Next, the order was given and the infantry moved. Crusader infantry attacked with ferocity and progressed, pushing back the Turks and getting further away from the walls. The infantry advance pushed the Turkish advance guards into retreat, which caused Kurbaga's men to panic. Not realizing what was happening, one portion of the Turkish force was now advancing into its own retreating men. Befuddled, the Turks went into full retreat, and even the troops in the citadel surrendered, deciding after what they had just observed they wanted no part of the Crusader army. And most of all, they wanted no part of Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman Crusader. This was easily the most impressive victory of the First Crusade thus far, and gave Bohemond's reputation legendary status. With Antioch in their hands, the final and key prize of the crusade lay ahead of them: Jerusalem. Now the Crusaders controlled an important stretch of land, from Nicaea to Edessa to Antioch. However, the struggle for Antioch had been daunting to say the least. The Crusaders decided to refresh for a time and wait to move on Jerusalem. Bohemond collected on the benefit of his prize to take the city and become ruler in Antioch, under the agreement that he could only control it as long as the Emperor Alexios did not come to claim it. Perhaps Bohemond owed thanks to Stephen II, Count of Blois, for making that an embarrassing impossibility for the emperor. Raymond, meanwhile, continued his opposition to what he viewed as Bohemond's self-serving duplicity. That may not have been entirely fair. Raymond reminded the lords of the good faith in which they had made their commitment spiritually and to Alexios. Not entirely unmoved by Raymond's reminders, they sent one last dispatch to the emperor, inviting him to come claim Antioch. Meanwhile, the Crusade leaders began to plan their attack on Jerusalem. Tension grew, however. Increasingly, Bohemond and Raymond were not seeing eye to eye on the right way forward. The only voice that seemed to mediate between them with any success, Adhémar Lepuy, had fallen ill and died, hitting all of the men pretty hard, perhaps especially Raymond and Bohemond. Months passed and they heard nothing from the emperor in Constantinople. It became clear during those waiting months that Bohemond was more interested in raising his own kingdom in Antioch than he was in attacking Jerusalem. In fairness, someone had to govern the city in the absence of emperor's instructions. No envoys, dispatches, instructions, and the threat from the Turks and other regional Islamic interests would not just sit by and allow European states to grow in the middle of Turkish Muslim strongholds. Terrified by the delays himself and greatly concerned about taking Jerusalem with a reduced force, Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, agreed to accept Bohemond's most specific terms about his rule in Antioch. That is, as long as he would promise to fulfill his commitment to help retake Jerusalem alongside the rest of the Crusaders. The Holy Sepulchre was, after all, the vision, the great goal of their years of toil. Bohemond agreed. November came and went, however, with no sign of movement from the force at Antioch. And more importantly, passivity seems to have come over Bohemond on the subject of planning an attack on Jerusalem. For his part, Raymond was leery of withdrawing from Antioch to leave the city totally under Bohemond's control. This left Raymond and those that sided with him with no moral ability to honor the commitment of the West in regards to their oaths of fealty to the Eastern Emperor. Yet at the same time, Raymond was not sure how they could take Jerusalem without Bohemond. The rank-and-file crusader knew that Jerusalem was the key reason for having come on crusade in the first place. Whatever the reason, Raymond and the growing number of those ready to move on had the keen sense that Bohemond was not going anywhere. The Crusaders began to gather around Raymond and ask him to lead them. They pressed him, and he finally relented and agreed that he would guide them in battle to retake Jerusalem for the church. As Raymond and the Crusaders left Antioch, they marched out the front gate of the city with Bohemond and all their allies and gracious brothers and sisters in Christ looking on. Raymond stripped down to rags, dirtied himself with grime, and presented himself as a pilgrim, barefoot and with a staff. To Bohemond, Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, would make the very clear point about the true purpose of the crusade in his mind, and in the mind of most crusaders undertaking this arduous journey with them. The force left Antioch with Raymond in the lead, his staff and his bare feet to guide them. They followed him singing hymns to the Lord and glorying that they were finally on their way to the prize of the crusade. All that is, except for Bohemond and his Norman force who stayed behind in Antioch save for a small contingent under Bohemond's little brother, Tancred, who once again appears to have had quite different motives than his brother regarding the spiritual implications of crusading, at least early on. Along the way, small Saracen forces rode out and paid tribute to the Crusaders in exchange for safety and just being left alone. By now, the Crusaders were an infamous force, which had attacked and defeated Kili Arslan, taken Edessa, defeated Yagi Sihan and taken Antioch, and defeated the great Kurbaga. Other small skirmishes happened, but this was clearly a high point for the reputation of the fighting skill of the first Christian Crusaders. On the other hand, avoiding conflict with the Crusaders might have only been one of the reasons the Saracens avoided conflict. Many of those that paid tribute were in rebellion to the Turkish leaders in Damascus, and not really interested in dying for them at the hands of the Crusaders. As would become a common theme, infighting in Islam was just as much an ally to the early Crusaders as their military capabilities. Moreover, Palestine was under the control of the Egyptian Fatimids. They had no interest in dying in battle to help the Seljuk Turks. The Fatimids had even sought alliance with the Crusaders that they would attack the Seljuks in return for the Crusaders' promise not to attack and take back Jerusalem. This could obviously not happen. All of Islam was about to learn why the crusade had happened, and exactly what the Crusaders were after, and it wasn't money or plunder.